Good evening, everybody. Welcome. On behalf of the Casa Italiana, in addition to the Bogliasco Foundation, I want to welcome you all. We're so pleased to have so many of you here tonight on this beautiful day for this event about Genoa's incredible cemetery, Staglieno. I want to thank, first of all, before anything else, the Casa Italiana. We've actually been doing partnership with Casa Italiana for about 8 years. This is our 11th event here in this space, and we are supremely grateful to have access to this space in order to share work that we've developed in our program, which I'll tell you about in a moment, with a public in New York. Just a few words about the Bogliasco Foundation, because I know many of you are here from the Casa Italiana, so that you know a little bit about what we do. We are a program that supports the arts and humanities and international cultural exchange by providing residential fellowships at our center near Genoa. We provide ideal work conditions and encourage cross-pollination in a diverse community made up of some of the world's most innovative minds. We have hosted in 23 years over 1,000 fellows from 61 countries and counting in all of the disciplines of the arts and humanities. So tonight's program is a little bit different than what we usually do. We tend to focus on an individual and an individual project. In this case, we're focusing on a place, a very special place, which is the cemetery in Genoa. And I should say that it's the idea for this event is born from a shared passion that many of us at the Bogliasco Foundation staff, as well as trustees, as well as many of our fellows share, a kind of reverence for this place, particularly those who've been fortunate enough to visit it when in the region of Genoa and who have fallen in love with it. So it's presenting basically 3 stories about Staglieno, 3 different stories, some more personal than others, by 3 different individuals. 2 of them, Bogliasco Fellows, 1 a special guest tonight. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about each of our presenters, and then we will turn it over to them. So, first up, we have Walter Arnold. Walter Arnold began sculpting stone at age 12, and at 20 became an apprentice in the marble carving studios of Pietrasanta, Italy, where he learned about Staglieno Cemetery and first began visiting it to learn from its statuary. After working for 5 years on the Washington National Cathedral in D.C., he returned to Chicago to establish his studio, where he is known for a variety of styles and his gargoyles in particular. In 2010, Walter and his wife established American Friends of Italian Monumental Sculpture, a U.S. nonprofit devoted to the preservation and restoration of Staglieno, for which Walter was recognized recently by the city of Genoa with the Grifo d'Oro Award, which is its highest honor bestowed upon an individual. Second up is 2001 Bogliasco Fellow Susan Unterberg. Susan is a New York-based photographer whose work has been exhibited broadly throughout the U.S. at institutions like the New Museum and can be found in such collections as the Metropolitan, the MoMA, the LA County Museum, among others. In addition to Bogliasco, she's been awarded fellowships at the American Academy in Rome, Yarrow, and McDowell, among many others, and was recently awarded NYU's Distinguished Alumni Award. In 2018, Susan stepped forward as founder and sole funder of the anonymous Was a Woman Award, which has awarded grants to over 230 women identifying artists over the age of 40 since 1996. Our final presenter of the evening is 2018 Bogliasco Fellow Grace Schulman. Grace was recently inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the former poetry editor of The Nation, former director of the Poetry Center at the 92nd Street Y, She's currently Distinguished Professor of English at Baruch College. Other honors include the 2016 Frost Prize for Distinguished Lifetime Achievement in Poetry in recognition of her 7 volumes of poetry, the Aiken-Taylor Award, 5 Pushcart Prizes, and a Guggenheim. About her poems, the late Harold Bloom has written, Grace Schulman has developed into one of the permanent poets of her generation. So each of our speakers is going to speak for about 15 minutes. After that, we will jump up on stage all together to take your questions. There will be a reception shortly after that. Now please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Walter Arnold.
Thank you. Buonasera. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Tonight I'm going to show you photos and tell you a little bit about the magnificent works of art at Staglieno Cemetery in Genoa and explain why I'm so passionate about them. Staglieno is a museum unique in the world and houses the greatest collection of mid-19th to mid-20th century Italian marble sculpture. While it covers over 80 acres, some 750 monumental works are in these large niches in the covered galleries, with another 750 smaller sculptures flanking them. A few thousand more sculptures can be found throughout the cemetery. In 1886, the Parisian newspaper Le Figaro announced that Staglieno was the most beautiful cemetery in the world. The English author Evelyn Waugh wrote in 1960 that if Père Lachaise and the Albert Memorial were obliterated, the loss would be negligible as long as this great repository survives. In the Victorian era, cemeteries played a large role in family and social life. Cemeteries were the public parks of the time. People would visit regularly, socialize with their friends, families would even picnic there. This is no longer the case. No longer a valued part of the cultural fabric, cemeteries like Staglieno have fallen victim to neglect. In the late 19th century, there was a marvelous confluence of demand and supply for magnificent memorial sculpture. Centuries of continual development of Italian sculpture led to the presence of a huge supply of great sculptors and artisans. Prior to this period, monuments were reserved for the aristocracy, military heroes, and religious figures. With the changes brought about by the Enlightenment and the unification of Italy came a new freedom and a new social structure. The mid-19th century was perhaps the first time in history where the middle class could create monuments to their own family and to their own success. Families commissioned the finest sculptors of the day to celebrate and commemorate their newfound status. As a central part of community life, cemeteries were the most appropriate place for these statements. Commissioning such a work of art was considered a contribution to the beauty of the city. But not long after these works were created, there was a change in taste. Modernism came along, and this work was no longer valued, viewed, or cared for, and this period of art was dismissed by art history. We turned our backs on these monuments and these sculptors, left them to decay, and forgot their names. I've seen the dramatic effects of neglect of climate and of pollution on these sculptures over the past decades. This is a treasure that, if lost, could never be recreated. The city of Genoa is able to run Staglieno as an active working cemetery, but lacks the resources, and until the last few years lacked the motivation or interest to maintain the infrastructure and protect these sculptures. I'm a sculptor and stone carver. I went to Italy, as you were told, when I was 20 years old to learn to carve in the traditional method, working with men like Luigi Marchetti, Danilo Cervietti. They were the sons and grandsons of the generation that created the sculptures at Staglieno. And they told me if I really wanted to know what could be done in marble, I had to visit Staglieno. And I've been returning ever since. The works I found there have been an inspiration and a guide throughout my career and my life. To help preserve these works is my way of giving back to the carvers who inspired me. Therefore, my wife and I created American Friends of Italian Monumental Sculpture, AFIMS, a nonprofit organization that's working with the city of Genoa to support the restoration of these masterpieces and to increase awareness of this amazing place. To date, we've been able to sponsor 15 restorations, but there's still so much more to be done. It all depends on our ability to spread our passion and to interest people in preserving these works. And we have been able to inspire the city to do more. In the past 3 years, they've restored the structure of a number of galleries, which is critical because there's no point restoring the sculptures if their roofs above them are leaking. The works at Staglieno encompass a full range of styles of art from the mid-19th to mid-20th century, from neoclassicism, romanticism, and bourgeois realism through symbolism, liberty, which is the Italian flavor of Art Nouveau, and Art Deco. And funerary sculpture covers a wide range of themes. These are a few of the most common themes that you will encounter. I mentioned bourgeois realism. That was a brief and overlooked period of art, part really ignored by art history, but it was a fascinating international style of the 1860s to 1890s. Breaking away from the earlier classicism and romanticism, the style demanded a clear, honest portrayal of its subjects without any idealism. It also required the highest level of virtuosity to depict every detail of the subjects. The young 30-something widow, Virginia Aprile, here she says goodbye to her husband of a dozen years, Raffaele Pianovi, who is 60 years her senior. She lifts the sheet for a last glance. The soft folds of the sheet draped over her husband are carved with such tenderness. Think about the difficulty to get a chisel underneath there and carve his face. And look at how the entire composition is done with her dress, everything moving towards that last glance to show her feelings for him. While Staglieno has many masterpieces of the bourgeois realist style, that's only one of many styles you'll find represented at Staglieno. By the way, this piece was inspired by Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. As you see, it's different from what you think of when you think of cemeteries in America. It really is an art museum. Gorgeous Art Nouveau piece. With the dirt really obscures the legibility. It's hard to see the figures, the spirits floating in the sky behind her. And they're magnificent works of Art Deco. Among the common themes is charity. Philanthropy was very important to the wealthy citizens of Genoa. Luigi Pastorini was a very generous philanthropist who funded a children's hospital. To honor this, sculptor Giuseppe Navone carved this monument. The angels are passing coins to the nun who is holding a sick boy. A little hard to see the boy because he's covered in such thick layers of dirt. But that bowl of coins just always amazes me. It's completely carved out and back. The face is carved on the coins. Look how the wrist of the hand holding the bowl has the weight of the bowl in it, and the hand catching the coins seems to be in movement. And as a carver, I look at that and think, how did they get a chisel inside to carve the palm of the hand? There's no direct point of access between the fingers and the coins to get in there. Absolute virtuoso work. There are, of course, a great number of religious works included in funerary sculpture. By the way, carving water in marble is rare, and I've only seen a few examples that are really successful, and this is one of the best. Children are a common theme. They portray innocence. They can convey the loss of a parent or grandparent, and in many cases, to honor the loss of a child. And the macabre was a very popular theme in Victorian literature and Victorian art, and it appears in quite a number of the sculptures. This one just really amazes me because this is simply the finest carved marble wing I've ever seen. It's on an angel. The sculptor Agostino Allegro was 25 years old when he did this piece. Unfortunately, sadly, he only lived to be 43, and his name is pretty much lost. There's almost no documentation on him. While most of the citizens of Genoa were Catholic, being a port city, it welcomed a very diverse population. Within the walls of Staglieno, there are Protestant, English, Eastern Orthodox, Muslim, and Jewish sections. The Jewish section suffers some of the worst neglect and deterioration. The Jewish community was very significant and vibrant before World War II, but was decimated in the Holocaust. So there are very few remaining. But in the last few years, the Jewish community has been trying to do some work to maintain and fix up their section. And our organization, AFIMS, was able to help a small amount. We'd like to do much more with them. But while the worst neglect can be found in that section, there's damage and problems everywhere. These were our first restorations in 2013. Lorenzo Rengo's sculptures of Benjamin Whitehead and his wife Julia Morrison Bentley, shown here in the middle before restoration and after. These two sculptures made a deep and lasting impression on me when I was 21 years old. I still recall the first time I saw them. But over the decades, I've seen the degradation, the decay from the neglect. We were able to catch them right at a point when the pollution, the mildew, everything was building up, where it was just about to start losing a lot of detail off of the surface, and we were able to catch it in time. If we hadn't had our intervention at that point, by now, a significant amount of the detail would be lost. Before restoration, Julia was covered in a thick, moist, black crust with green moss and mildew. I didn't even realize she was wearing gloves. People walked by, didn't stop to look at her. They were repelled by the dirt. Now, passersby all stop and admire these wonderful sculptures. Leonard Bistolfi was the leading Italian symbolist and Art Nouveau sculptor. His works are in museums around the world, but this is one of his masterpieces. It's located in a very humid and overgrown section hidden in back of the Protestant section of Staglieno Cemetery. Here you see before and after the results of our restoration work. And this is sculptor Giovanni Scanzi's masterpiece, his memorial to Giacomo Carpenetto. This really pushes marble to its limits. Magnificent dramatic work of a young angel struggling to control a sailboat. It was covered in a thick layer of black crust and dirt, and it had graffiti all over it. The boat was full of garbage. It was first cleaned with distilled water and cotton swabs, and then several applications of cellulose poultices, which is a paste-like compound that is put on, left for several days, and it draws out the dirt. Then other delicate cleaning solutions and methods were used on the most stubborn areas, and some broken elements repaired. Restoration like this takes about 4 months. This is the next piece we plan to undertake, Antonio Rota's 1887 memorial to the Gnecco family. The 2 orphans are saying goodbye to their mother. The angel is pointing up as their mother floats up to heaven, where the dead siblings are floating up above as cherubs. I've only given you a small taste of the abundance of treasures at Staglieno, but I hope you'll agree with me that this is one of Italy's greatest hidden art treasures, and perhaps I've inspired a few of you to visit Staglieno. We have many more photos on our website and hundreds of photos on our Facebook and Instagram page, so I hope you'll follow us there and look through all the pictures and see some of the thousands of sculptures. Also, perhaps if you have other friends who love Italy and love art, please share our Facebook and Instagram with them and let them know about this wonderful place so that it will no longer be forgotten. I'd like to thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. So my presentation's a bit different, but I'm glad you had a background of what the cemetery really is like. I arrived at Bogliasco on September 9th, 2001. I was looking forward to a wonderful month of making work and spending time in Liguria. I have always loved cemeteries, particularly Highgate in London, which was built in Victorian times, especially those that function like a public space. My plan at Bogliasco had always been to make work at the Staglieno Cemetery, which is filled with monumental sculpture and was built roughly at the same time as Highgate in the mid-19th century. When 9/11 hit, I was at Bogliasco for 2 days, and then 9/11. I was suddenly in the position of watching a tragedy unfold in my hometown over the television screen. I watched the images of people running away from the towers, everything covered in ashes, and I was struck by the similarity to what I was seeing at Staglieno. These ashen statues, already realistic, became even more lifelike as I imagined what was going on back in New York. There was such a discrepancy between being at the rarefied, exquisite Bogliasco and the helplessness I felt at watching 9/11 and its effects unfold from so far away. Like all New Yorkers, I knew people who were in the area for work or casually, and besides, my children and then young grandchildren live in the city. Working in the cemetery, I found myself looking at these sculptures as if they were people alive today, similar to how people describe the uncanny contemporaneous of the Egyptian Fayum funerary portraits. And of course, at the front of my mind was thinking about all the dead and dying in New York. Another reference that comes to mind is of the casts of the mummified bodies of Pompeii. This affected how I began making this work. I wanted to create elegiac portraits of the sculptures in Staglieno rather than take a more documentary approach to the statuary and architecture. All of my photographic work has always steered away from the documentary. At first, I felt very tentative about this. I even brought flowers on my first visit to honor the dead and not alarm the suspicions of any of the cemetery guards. Within a few days of going, realizing that nobody there was watching or paying attention to me, I felt much freer, taking over a large work ladder with a platform in order to photograph the faces, which were quite high from the ground. Choosing the statues was dependent on being physically elevated enough to photograph them. This guy, with his hands touching his neck, seems like he's died too young. His eyes are closed and eyebrows are raised, as though he is deep in prayer. He looks very alone and colorless, like each statue. She could be someone's grandmother, more serene than most grandmothers. It looks like she is resigned to death, kind of like an every woman could be anyone. This one looks like a doll, much too young to have died. She reminded me of Ophelia. Another one who has died too young, maybe 5 or 6. What's he thinking? His hands are clasped, his beauty is so clear. Some of the images I liked best were intentionally blurry. I felt also that when I was cropping closely, I found this took the statues out of their environment and allowed me to imagine them both as individuals outside of this massive cemetery and as symbols which I could relate to my immediate political feelings of 9/11. Here's another older person. Her eyes are open. She looks alive and resigned to death. As I started to see them as a body of work, it struck me that the gray palette of the cemetery and marble sculptures began to resemble traditional black and white portraiture, blurring the sense of living and dead even more. It is also a way to connect the statues to photographic ideas of capturing the moment. I was attracted to this one because of her serenity, and this one ended up looking the most like a death mask. A number of years later, in 2008, these ideas developed into a series of human statuary. I began to look at people as statues and wondered what I could do to enhance this. I'm including a few here. That's me. I became interested in using photographic tools to translate actual humans who I knew into sculpture. The sculptures at Staglieno were necessarily from a different time and place, so my access to the lives and histories of the people they represented was inferred. In the newer work, I could think about these forms of the dead, but with a specific knowledge of their subject. This became a way of further expanding these thoughts about death and the fleeting nature of life, and how we represent a sense of life in the faces and expressions of the dead. Still, this is a kind of tangent in my work. Pulling together these images for tonight has helped me to see how it has remained an underlying concern, but that is not something I've become very conscious of. As long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with the Holocaust, so tragedy and death are not exactly new themes. These ideas would continue to have an effect on my work. In a 2012 series of self-portraits, the idea of statuary and the emotive began to be something I could play with, especially as my own expression tended toward what I see as grotesque and absurd. I would take the images of myself, making theatrical and horrific expressions, which I would then alter. As I was putting together this talk, I thought again about why I had made these. I wanted to see myself as an aged woman, a crone, old. It is a way to visualize the indignity of life as one gets closer to death. I was reminded of Fellini's women, particularly Giulietta Messina in La Strada. Thinking about these images for this talk, I realized I also wanted them to replace the very ordinary masks of beauty, appropriateness, and calmness that are so socially accepted of women, and which I feel are often applied to me. Instead, these images allow me to explore other kinds of masks, in this case, reflecting on extreme emotions that women aren't supposed to express: fear, madness, horror, and aging. Actually, these expressions aren't that exaggerated, especially thinking about my responses to current politics and what is going on in the world. As I've considered these, it's been interesting to see how such an interior-seeming body of work has such a connection to politics from my original response to 9/11 at Bogliasco to my present works, which are a series of artist books dealing with the Trump administration, and current politics. So these three bodies of work demonstrate the lasting impact that my stay at Bogliasco has had on me and my work. So thank you very much.
My stay at Bogliasco last year was a life changer. It changed my life and work in wonderful new ways, and a highlight of that stay was my visit to the Staglieno Cemetery. Just before I got there, my memoir had come out. Oh dear.
Just this is forward.
It's better. My memoir had come out, Strange Paradise, which had to do with my husband's death. And so the Staglieno Cemetery spoke to me in ways that put many things in perspective. And I wrote this sequence of poems based on sculptures here. It's called Alive and Well, Tomb Sculptures in the Staglieno Cemetery. The first is, as you see, Angel. So this is death, lifelike in marble and unconsoling on a merchant's tomb. No man with a scythe, no man at all, but her, slim-hipped in an airy gown, nipped at the waist. On the high breast, one hand rests, the slender fingers limp, waiting to beckon or direct. Come hither, lips, barbed wings. The eyes translucent, clear lakes you want to fathom, but the gaze says, I don't want to be known or understood. Angel of cold passion, angel of sex and death, essential answers hidden in one vamp. When I pass by, she turns to follow. Death, you terrify, just as you lure me with a knowing glance. I was struck by, when you walk into a cemetery in America or England or anywhere in the world, in Europe really, angels are covered up. Not in Italy. They are. It's the fascination of the sacred and the sexual combined in one art form, which haunted me and haunts me still. The next poem in this sequence is called Widow. Walter Arnold just showed it in detail. It's quite a sculpture. Widow, I know her by the pleated satin dress, hair in a bun, the hesitation as she lifts the sheet, letting air in, astonished, peering into darkness. What will she find there? At her husband's body, suddenly altered. Questions run through her. Dare she kiss the lips now growing colder? Can he hear her? Leaning awkwardly, loath to leave him, venturing a touch. She asks now, why him? In unending silence, she clings to precise details for an answer, side-glancing at the unmade bed, the high pile of cushions falling from their place. I know her by my husband's silver watch that hasn't stopped. The still warm belly, the pearl pajama button on the terrace. The next is called Dreamer. Interesting about this statue, the woman is fully clothed and holding poppies in her hand, which is traditionally a symbol of sleep or mourning. But I read in one of the pamphlets at the foundation that there was some controversy about placing the statue here. And the controversy had to do perhaps with the nature of poppies, which were perhaps a symbol of unnatural sleep, perhaps a drug, perhaps opium. Interesting that no statues were ever forbidden to come to the cemetery because of their extremely sexual nature, but the poppies did it. Anyway, this poem is called Dreamer. Clerics opposed her installation here, so close to rosaries, hands clasped in prayer. Officials said a travesty of holiness, pagan, impious, other slurs unclear. What was it? Not the lips about to part, the mouth to speak, the tousled hair, the robe that slides down a bare shoulder, curvy hips. Those were the sculptor's art. Nor was it her calm perch, dreaming, not dead. The dream, though, those three ovals in her hand, seemingly blossoms, are poppy pods formed after flowering, from whose sticky substance opium is drawn. Demeter, in grief over her daughter's fate, would sip the stuff to soothe her loss. At the Staglieno, sexy is fine, is life. Addiction, no. This next one is Maria Francesca. It's quite lovely. Eyes shut, as in elation more than death, the legs straining to spring from their marble bed. A sheet slipped to reveal the nude young breasts, spool waist. Not the shattered body found in a car crash, fingers severed and flung. This likeness is perfect, shaped from a photograph. Notice the glow, the urge to speak, to love. Unlike some broken statues hinting at arms and phalluses, she gleams in all her parts. Alone but not alone. Her man in marble bends to kiss her and clutch her thigh, not in lust, but in finality. I know the scene, your body fixed, but yearning to move again. I'm moving now in scattered pieces over miles and time, free neither to finish the task of life nor to abandon it. And this last one, struggle. As you can see, the living woman dying is quite bare at the top, and the figure of death is holding her by the wrist. If these stones were flesh, you'd hear their cries. Death, blank-faced and stiff, and alive the woman who won't be taken by those tigery claws without a kick, a blow, a fierce objection. She bends, covered waist down in see-through tulle, actually marble carved to look ethereal with the same mallet, calipers, and chisel the sculptor used to shape rock into muscle. Waist up, exposed, but raging, unafraid. The work unfinished, dinners to order, dresses to try on, letters to write. When, that last night, you called for slacks and blazer from your sickbed, I watched the pull away the savage, sun-driven, though futile, fight. Thank you.
Test. So we wanted, whoops, this is working, right? Yeah, we wanted to open it up to any questions or comments anybody cares to make. Yeah, right there.
The second lecture, I didn't understand what she did with the sculptures. Did she, the sculptures that we saw, were they her own sculptures?
Are you talking to me? Yes. Were they what sculptures?
Her own sculptures? No. Like the women who were, had their mouths open, you know, and...
No, that was from 2007.
Is that your own sculpture?
No, it's my own photographs. They were self-portraits that it was, I presented the work I did at Bogliasco, which were the actual sculptures. And then it no longer had to do with the Staglieno Cemetery, but switched to another body of work that had to do with human statuary. And then the third body of work had to do with these grotesques. So they all grew out of thinking about statues and death and...
What I don't understand is, are they sculptures of someone else or your own?
They're photographs.
Photographs of?
Me.
Of yourself? Okay, thank you.
Yes, right there.
I just wanted to ask Mr. Arnold, how do you decide what to restore? out of those immense numbers of beautiful things?
It is a difficult decision. I work closely with the Superintendenza, which is the provincial department that oversees all the art treasures, and there's a wonderful art historian there who has studied these works for decades. And so it's a balance of things. In some ways it's triage, which ones are at a point that they need it, but in a location where, you know, as I said, if the roof above is leaking, there's no point doing it. Which ones have, you know, real artistic importance, are at a point when we can save them and they need it. And also, part of it is needing to do pieces that will attract attention and appeal to, you know, future donors, to people who will be interested, which means something that's a typical cemetery sculpture, typical angel that you'll see in 1,000 cemeteries, isn't going to excite people. So try to go for things that are much more interesting artistically. But once it gets narrowed down to that, there's still, we don't know how many sculptures there are. There are at least 4,000. So it's a difficult decision.
I just want to say in general, I thought the juxtaposition of talks, was brilliant.
You mentioned distilled water and cotton swabs and poultices. What I wondered is, after the pieces have been cleaned, is there any particular sealant that you use to keep it from, again, absorbing the air pollution and whatnot?
Yes, there are some sealants. Fortunately, 25 years ago, the sealants used in art restoration were problematic. It's been improved greatly. The current ones are breathable, so moisture that gets in gets out again, which also means the sealants have to be redone every few years. But we also try to do follow-up maintenance on all of them. So we've been working with art restorers to go around periodically and do maintenance. We're also working with the city. I've been convincing the city to take over the maintenance program. And in fact, there was a meeting today between an art restorer and a number of people from the city to talk about a long-term maintenance program, because they're the ones we've restored, but also since we started, the city's been getting more local people to sponsor, and so there are a lot others that have been restored in the last 2 or 3 years.
I'll go back up. Thank you. I'm very moved by the pristine face of Genoa with the restoration that has begun and has been since the 1980s. I was there in the 80s, and it was a really sad place. And the soot and the anger, it was like a children's book, Stone Soup. It didn't have the warmth of other places in Italy, which I found surprising, but now I understand the history behind that. I see the pain, I see the historical context much clearer than I did, I guess, how many years ago? A while ago. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your beautiful speeches. I'd like to address a question to Ms. Schulman. You began your speech about talking about the profundity of the experience and how it changed your life. Could you extemporize on that?
It's a wonderful question, and I don't know how to answer it. It's so large. It's so very large. Working there, amidst the culture of Italy, getting to know the temper of the people in the landscape was lifting, of course, and the foundation gave us the freedom to work undistracted, completely undistracted, in a cultural setting that was very inspiring. But I did want to point out that going to the cemetery was a highlight of that experience because of my own experience with my husband's recent death and the sense that life came from these sculptures. Alive and Well is the title of my sequence. I had a sense of life from death that pervaded my whole stay there. I was alive. During the work came alive for me. That's the best I can do.
Do any of the families get involved with the restorations?
Okay. In theory, legally, the families are responsible for maintaining the sculptures. However, after 100 or 150 years, the families are very spread out. And in fact, the Superintendenza, which I mentioned, the organization responsible for the pieces, a number of years back, sent 100 registered letters to different families telling them that they are legally responsible to maintain these works. The problem is they're legally responsible, there's nothing behind the law to force them. So they got a total of 0 responses to those letters. Before we can do them, because officially they still belong to the city, the ones we're interested in, the city does a research to find out if there are any family members at all connected to it. And in general, there's no one really to be found. When they found them, we need to get permission from them, and typically they will give us a letter saying it's okay for us to restore them as long as they have no financial or legal liability. I have once or twice in all my times there, in fact once this spring, there was a young man, probably about 25 years old, who was there with all kinds of proper cleaning supplies, working on the family memorial, and I chatted with him, and he said, oh yes, it's our responsibility. Different family members come out periodically to take turns to come and take care of it. But that's, I've only seen that maybe twice in all this time.
People leave flowers and whatnot.
Yes. People leave flowers, and there are beautiful florist shops in front where you can either get flowers or artificial flowers. And a lot of those are left not necessarily by family members, but by other visitors who are coming and want to honor pieces. And there are always family members there who are there, old widows who are up there to, some of the small graves up on the hills they're cleaning off. By the way, I've had some interesting conversations with them because there's the question of the weird dichotomy of being a sacred place and a burial ground and a place of mourning and an art museum. And whenever I talk to these elderly widows who are there, they are so happy that people are coming and appreciating the work of art, and that it's not the way it was 5-10 years ago when there'd be no one and it would be abandoned, that people respect it and are inspired by it, and they like that and they want more of it.
Is Mary Shelley, Mary Shelley's buried in Staglieno, isn't she?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Oscar Wilde's wife is there.
That's right.
Very, very ordinary, too.
Yes.
There's no sculpture there.
Is it still used as a cemetery for?
Yes, there are 117,000 grave sites. It's a very active cemetery. Pretty much every day there are burials going on. Also, cemeteries operate differently in Italy than here. Most of these monuments are perpetual. But other than that, most of the sites are either like 99-year or 50 or 20-year leases. So there are big open fields of more standard gravestones that are on 20-year leases, and rotating every 20 years, one will get excavated completely, and there's a crematorium, everything moved there, and then they start over in that area. And that's actually standard practice in Italy.
Yeah, I actually have a question for Susan, which was that I guess it was pretty, well, the way you discussed it also, it was clear that the series of portraits that you did where I don't know how you made them exactly, but the photographs that were of friends and so on, they had a kind of sculpted look to the shoulders, then followed by the body of work that you showed of yourself.
Yes.
I mean, those were clearly meant to be some kind of memorial, like, or they had a feeling of memorial to them, the previous ones.
Right.
So I guess I'm wondering in terms of the self-portraits that you did, whether it's almost like wanting to have control of your own narrative after you're dead or something. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, the
looking at
third
some-
body was emotive, and it had nothing to do with me being dead.
No,
It was about masking, you know.
Right. No, I came out wrong. I didn't mean you dead, but just that, you know, it's when you look at these the sculptures that are in the cemetery, you know, somebody has concretized something about you and something about the person that has died, and so I was just wondering if in some way. That's how I meant it. Like whether, you know, you were, because they could be almost seen as sculptures. They could be made into that.
Right.
And you
say I'm not a sculptor, but
yeah.
But it was human statuary that I pulled that series, and the people I picked are living
Right.
and known to me.
Right.
Some of them I did at Yaddo, and some I did at home. And I was trying to compare how I imagined lives at the Staglieno statues, and with these that, you know, I knew the people, so I could imagine what they might be thinking or what they might be like if somebody were to make a statue of them later
That
on.
had nothing to do with the series later of yourself.
No.
Because, you know, you were sort of putting a kind of a more of a feminist spin on it. And, you know, when you go to a cemetery, I mean, aside from Grace's references to how sexual some of them are, that there's a kind of a dignity to the whole thing.
Right.
And the pictures of that you took of yourself were pretty raw, sometimes
Right.
funny and not very becoming.
Exactly.
So I wondered if there was some...
But there is a connection, I
Yeah.
think, because of the idea of masks. We all wear masks, you know, when we present ourselves in public. And in statuary, it is an idealized mask usually. So I kind of do make that connection in my own mind. But you're right, they're completely different.
Right.
Okay. I'd like to add a little to that. And some of the pictures will also appear in the ones going up here. You might see a few, but the Baroque realist period, they were deliberately not idealizing. They would show people with their jowls and their warts and everything else. So she would have seen at Staglieno a lot of those sculptures that were deliberately not idealized at all. And you look at them and you see people that you could know and talk to.
There's a question back there.
Yeah. I was curious, Grace, actually, how often you actually frequented Staglieno, and also how often you had frequented Staglieno, and also if any lines really sort of physically began there, and did they stick throughout the cycle of poems?
Henry James once said that if you want to write about a barracks, all you have to do is look in the door, not join the army, but just... And I would have hung out there every day if I could, but I couldn't get a ride.
It was about a half an hour away, as I remember.
And so really it was just one day, but it was all day. And I was mesmerized when I was there. And you couldn't tear me away from the place. I was just glued to it, just adhered to it. Yes, I heard lines when I was there. And my thought about the other question that was asked about changing my work and life is that a new form came to me. These poems are sonnets, with the voice breaking through. That is, they're not ostensible sonnets. I don't want you to think they're sonnets, but they are. And that voice was breaking through the form in the same way that the dignity of death was the structure, and the living sexuality was breaking through that solidity and dignity of death. That is, the two things together were colliding in a way that my form was colliding, the formal sonnet and the speech rhythms cutting through. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, because there's an enormous sense of the physicality and a sense of duration and time running throughout your poems. I mean, it didn't have to be correlated specifically, but that sense of length, I think, is very much in your work.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
Maybe just one last question.
There's something in Susan's work that I think is particularly related to the in relation to the cemetery, and I think also for me looking at it, it's as if you transform the experience. I think they're quite connected, in fact, and it feels to me like you transform the experience of the stillness of death and then the masks of your friends into something that both was very active and also almost calligraphic. You know, it looks like it's sculpture going to drawing in a way, because I mean the hair in those images, and also the spirit of motion and I would say the joy and the freedom of the gestures. You know, so it was almost as if you were kind of, you know, bounding out of where you started. If you say the cemetery first, and then the sort of very still images of friends in a negative form, and then this kind of, I think they're astonishing.
Thank you,
yeah.
Stuart.
So I think we'll probably leave it there, and you know
I just want to say thank you very much. I'm Stefano, I'm the director of the Casa. I just wanted to thank Laura Harrison and the staff of the Bogliasco Foundation for the great panel that they brought to us tonight. As you know, we do this kind of initiatives also with other Italian-related foundations and organizations, and yesterday we did an event with Save Venice that, interestingly enough, presented a contemporary artist that did this impossible enterprise of the red regatta in Venice, like convincing sailors to paint their sails in red and creating really something magic. And I congratulate you and Save Venice, because in this way, I think it's not only the scholar, like our restorer, that talks about the process of studying and understanding and preserving these statues, but it's beautiful to see how these ancient monuments speak to today's artist, a photographer, a poet. And I think we are really bridging a gap there, because we normally have the scholars that do their thing, normally studying old stuff, and the artists that do their thing that is very rarely contaminated, quote unquote, by old stuff. And I think tonight, thanks to the Bogliasco Foundation, you really bridged that gap and showed that there is a dialogue possible that goes across the centuries, across the mediums of expression. And for this, I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank again our wonderful presenters. And please join us upstairs for a glass of wine or Prosecco before you go.